It is hard to comprehend now. It can seem so absurd, looking back from this distance at our world as the propaganda films reflected it. But it was very real.
We
all thought that Americans were just standing around thinking about how to launch a missile or send us poisoned candy. To us, there was nothing human about them.
Выглядит этот западный заправила. Но не мир, а война ему нужна.
The Cold War created a world of mutual fear and threat, full of enemies. 3 years before the missile crisis, Nikita Khrushchev had become the first Soviet leader ever to visit the United States, the first Soviet leader Americans had ever seen.
We were making the half-hour drive into Washington. I still remember it. It was an absolutely astonishing sight. Crowds of people were standing along the sides of the road, waving flags, but absolutely silent. It was the silence of the tomb. It was as if the delegation and Khrushchev were from the moon. Later I realized that was America's impression of us.
We eyed each other, President Eisenhower would say, across a trembling world. John Kennedy will challenge Richard Nixon for the presidency of the United States. The campaign will center on the issue of the Cold War. Which man could best stand up to Nikita Khrushchev?
You realize that you are voting for the most important individual in the entire free world.
He shall determine whether we shall be at war or peace. This is the key office, and I run for the presidency because, like you, I have strong ideas about what this country must do. I have strong ideas about the United States, playing a great role in a historic moment when the cause of freedom is endangered all over the world. That's what I think this election is about. That's what we're going to begin to do on next Tuesday.
And then came Fidel Castro's revolution, hailed by many Cubans as the moment of their true independence, when they defeated the US-backed regime. The Soviets, particularly Khrushchev, see Cuba as the harbinger of socialism in the American hemisphere. So does the United States. By the time John Kennedy is elected president, Fidel Castro has become a junior partner on the other side of the Cold War. The Cold War will become a high-stakes game of chicken in Berlin and a crucial test of nerve between the Soviet leader and the young American president. Khrushchev is afraid of losing Cuba, afraid that Kennedy will decide to expand his secret CIA operation against Castro and use the military. He is also afraid of losing the nuclear arms race so badly he might invite an American first strike. His twin fears lead him to a dangerous nuclear gamble. It is a fateful gamble to deploy some of his most threatening weapons in Cuba. Castro says yes, believing it better, he says, to risk a great crisis than to wait impotently for the American invasion. But he argues that Khrushchev should deploy the missiles openly. Khrushchev refuses.
We thought we had enough to destroy each other, that neither country would risk war. Those nuclear weapons were only a threat, only a threat.
Nikita Khrushchev's nuclear arsenal includes medium and intermediate range missiles that are of no use against the United States because they cannot get there from the Soviet Union. But were they to be launched from Cuba, every state except Washington and Oregon would be vulnerable. The missile gap between the two superpowers would suddenly shrink. So Khrushchev plans to deploy 60 of these missiles and their nuclear warheads in Cuba in secret. It is a major undertaking. Never before has the Soviet Union moved missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads outside its own borders. Never before has it moved more than 40,000 men in secret, almost 8,000 miles away. Always there is the danger that the Americans will discover what is going on. In the late summer of 1962, Washington watches the Soviet military buildup on Cuba and worries. But U.S. intelligence advises President Kennedy that transferring nuclear missiles to the island secretly is all but impossible. As the midterm election draws closer, Khrushchev assures Kennedy privately that the buildup consists of defensive weapons only. But the Republicans accuse the president of ignoring a dangerous buildup right under his nose.
He wants a Congress that will say yes to the Russian buildup in Cuba. The American people don't want that.
I have a preliminary statement. There has been a great deal of talk on the situation in Cuba in recent days.
On September 13th, Kennedy issues a warning designed to prove to the Republicans that he will draw the line on Cuba.
Once again, if at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, or become an offensive military base of significant capacity for the Soviet Union, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies.
Kennedy boxes himself in and puts on the record a threat he assumes will never be more than a threat. On the 14th, a high-flying American U-2 spy plane photographs Cuba, and photo intelligence in Washington first discovers 6 canvas-covered objects, each of them more than 60 feet long. October 16th, after breakfast in the White House, the president is told. Intelligence is able to identify 3 missile sites in various stages of readiness. The president is forced to confront the fact that 80 million Americans, up and down the East Coast, across the South, and as far west as Dallas, are now vulnerable to Soviet nuclear attack, with virtually no warning. From the beginning, the president rejects the idea of warning Khrushchev privately lest he give him the advantage. By the end of the 3rd day, aware of the risks, ExComm seems ready to recommend that the president impose a quarantine. On Friday, they receive startling new aerial pictures of Cuba. Some of the missiles are apparently in a position to be launched. It is now up to one single man, Robert Kennedy will say, and he summons his brother back to Washington. The president orders his press secretary to tell reporters he has a cold. Saturday, October 20th. In 5 days, the president has gone from outrage to fear and now to caution. He chooses the quarantine, but he will also try to appease those pressing for stronger military action with a promise. If the quarantine is not effective within a few days, he will authorize an airstrike, followed by an invasion of Cuba. He asks the networks for television time on Monday night and orders the military to prepare. In the Kremlin, they fear Kennedy will announce that the invasion of Cuba is already underway. For Nikita Khrushchev, the Caribbean crisis has begun. For Americans, the public phase of the missile crisis is about to begin, and it will be terrifying.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified. I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
For many in the television audience in countries all around the world, nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union now seems imminent.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war. He's on dangerous ground and skating on thin ice.
Khrushchev is belligerent And he considers a blockade, whatever the Americans choose to call it, an act of war.
They said they had every right to do this. We had no right to stop them, that this was a violation of international law. That's all perfectly correct. But it was clear we were going to do it, regardless.
In the White House, the president will tell his brother, the great danger in all this is a miscalculation, a mistake. Wednesday morning, October 24th, 36 hours after the president's speech. If the Soviets do not yield, a shooting war between the two nuclear superpowers may begin at sea. Robert Kennedy tells his brother that if he had not acted, he would have been impeached. That's what I think, the president will say. I would have been impeached. 150 American ships have now isolated Cuba. 25 Soviet ships are steaming towards them. The Americans have orders to stop any Soviet ship and board. If there is resistance, the orders are to fire. Then at 10:25 a.m., military intelligence reports to the White House 16 Soviet ships have either stopped dead in the water or turned back. Most of us remember that moment the ship stopped as the moment the crisis ended. American aircraft can monitor progress on getting the huge missiles ready to fire. But they cannot see the nuclear warheads that would enable those missiles to deliver catastrophe. Washington can only guess.
That was 36 missiles with their warheads.
Each warhead was 1 megaton. That is 50 Hiroshimas. That's a terrible force.
The 12 Lunas, each with a range of only 25 miles, are deployed along Cuba's coast. In the places the Soviets expect U.S. landing forces will try to come ashore. In the White House, they do not know what is on the ground in Cuba, not the number of troops, nor weapons, nor about the warheads. And as each day goes by with no concession from the Soviets, the drumbeat for military action grows more insistent. President Kennedy orders U.S. strategic forces to a higher level of alert. Nuclear war is less and less an abstract possibility. More and more, it is real.
To show our seriousness and to show our willingness to wage nuclear war if necessary, for the first time, the Strategic Air Command went to Defense Condition 2, which is the second level, which means you are prepared to conduct operations when so ordered. The strategic forces of the United States were prepared to act if called upon.
Defense Condition 2, in military shorthand, DEFCON 2. Were the president to escalate to DEFCON 1, the U.S. military would be fighting a nuclear war. By Thursday night, almost 1,500 strategic bombers have been put on constant alert. 200 are in the air at all times. All the aircraft are carrying nuclear weapons. 145 intercontinental nuclear missiles are ready to fire. Every one of them is targeted on the Soviet Union. Never before, and never since, has the United States moved to this state of nuclear alert. Mr. President, Khrushchev writes, we ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when it will be tied so tight that we will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will be necessary to cut the knot, to doom the world to the catastrophe of nuclear war. It is one of several signals that the Soviets may be looking for a way out. But ExComm receives intelligence that work on the launch pads in Cuba has accelerated. The president orders the overflights increased from twice a day to once every 2 hours. Soviet commanders know that with every reconnaissance flight, their positions are more and more vulnerable to an American airstrike. They repeatedly ask Moscow for permission to shoot. Moscow is silent. By Friday afternoon, the Soviets have moved many of their nuclear warheads from storage to the launch sites. They can be mated with their missiles in a matter of hours. The ambassador cables Khrushchev. We have taken all necessary measures. As they wrestle with the conflicting messages from Moscow, fearful that Khrushchev is losing control, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down over Cuba. Its pilot is killed. Shooting down the U-2 was not sanctioned by Moscow. In Washington, they do not know that. An hour later, the Soviets discover an American U-2 in their airspace over Siberia. MiGs are ordered to intercept it.
And this pilot had turned around and picked the wrong star to go back. And he was over the Soviet Union, and you could hear him screaming over the radio. You see, I could hear him screaming in this phone. The MiGs are scrambling. You know, I can see them, he said. I can see them. They're falling out. They're missing me, but they're scrambling. Give me a sight home. You see, he was over the Soviet Union. He'd violated Soviet airspace. I dropped the phone and ran upstairs to tell the president. Of course, I hadn't had any sleep for 36 hours, and that had been preceded by 10 days of 4 hours a night. And so I blurted this message out, and it was a terrible calm. You know, Mac Mundy was there, Mrs. Lincoln, and the president, and a couple other people. And everybody, you know, was thinking, oh my God, suppose the Soviets think that this is a reconnaissance for a first strike, they may be counting down right now.
Here is an American action of a reconnaissance plane off course over the Soviet Union that we did not control.
Secretary of Defense McNamara, we must be in a position to attack quickly. We've been fired on today. We're going to send surveillance aircraft in tomorrow. Those are going to be fired on without question. You can't do this very long. You're going to lose airplanes, and we'll be shooting up Cuba quite a bit. We're going to lose airplanes every day. So you can't just maintain this position very long. We must be prepared to attack Cuba quickly.
The noose was tightening, the president's brother would say. The bridges to escape were crumbling. The president knows that if there is an invasion of Cuba, it will match in scope the D-Day invasion of Europe. He does not know that the Soviet commander on the ground has the authority to resist using battlefield nuclear weapons. At 7:45 that night, Robert Kennedy summons Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to meet him at the Justice Department. The president will agree, he tells the ambassador, to move American missiles out of Turkey. But the deal is secret. Only a handful of Kennedy's own advisors know. If it becomes public, it will be denied. It is the final American offer. Khrushchev has 24 hours to respond. Then just before dawn, he receives a cable from his ambassador in Washington describing the conversation with Robert Kennedy the night before. It was somewhere between a threat and a prayer, Khrushchev would say. The president both demanded and begged. It is clear to him that he's out of time. He rushes to broadcast his answer to Kennedy live over Radio Moscow. In exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba, he will pull his missiles out. Khrushchev agrees to move the missiles out of Cuba on the decks of Soviet ships in full view. His generals describe the withdrawal as humiliating. Castro calls it betrayal.
We were faced with a true betrayal. Fidel said, after everything we have done.
The public thinks the danger is over. It is not. Kennedy demands that Soviet bombers be withdrawn along with the missiles. Castro balks. Khrushchev stalls. U.S. nuclear forces will not be taken off alert until the bombers are removed 22 days later. The two men who have come so close are fundamentally changed by the experience.
Our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.